Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Bruce. I trust that people can hear me all right. First, I want to thank you for inviting me, but mostly for allowing me to participate remotely. I'm currently based in Ottawa. I can assure you that it is warmer where you are than where I am. So I would have been delighted to be with you at the conference this week, but I recently accepted the position of Vice President of Research Partnerships at the National Granting Council, NSERC, in Canada, and I could no longer be with you this afternoon. So again, thank you for allowing me to participate. I know it's not quite as exciting to have just speakers, microphones and speakers, but I can also assure you that seeing me live would not necessarily add a great deal to my presentation. I'm really happy to participate this afternoon because it allows me to bring two components to the table, and I think very few people have this combination of expertise. I did spend most of my career in agriculture and agri-food. I'm a molecular geneticist by training. I've spent a lot of time working on genetically modified food, genetically modified crops. I've worked on genes, worked on breeders to introduce those genes, to track those genes, and I was quite active with GMO first conversation some years ago. I've also, for the last 7 years, been at the Department of National Defense, where I led their scientific effort. And being in part of the Department of National Defense, one gets exposed to new and emerging threats that are happening around the world. Again, very few people get to see the inside of those analyses, those threat analyses that are done. I'd like to bring those two worlds together this afternoon for a brief moment and set the stage for other speakers to perhaps dive more specifically in a subset of those threats. So I'll touch upon a series of topics that are related to perhaps a non-conventional approach to food security. When we talk about security and national security, we often refer to either terrorist attacks, regional religious conflicts, suicide bombers, and so on and so forth. These are obviously real threats, and we see them executed in different parts of the world, and I'm certainly not one to minimize them. They are, however, fairly low-tech threats, fairly low-tech attacks that have devastating consequences, no doubt. But I think we need to turn our attention not so much to those, but to emerging threats that will change our world as well. So I trust everyone can still hear me well. Bruce, are we still online?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So I'd like to start with a little story some of you may be familiar with. It's a computer virus called Stuxnet. It's a computer virus that was inserted some time ago in the control systems of uranium enrichment plants, of one uranium enrichment plant in Iran. That virus was inserted through a connection. The virus stayed dormant for a number of months. And while it was dormant, it was collecting information on the operations of the plant itself, of the machinery in the plant. At some point it got activated, and it directed the uranium centrifuges to spin out of control. Essentially, it pushed the centrifuges over their operational limits that led them to essentially be destroyed. essentially destroyed the uranium enrichment plant. This is an intervention that was done simply using sophisticated computer viruses. Now imagine for a second a similar virus inserted into the operating system of a large food processor that would modify food formulation, modify stocks of ingredients, modify cooking times. This is not really science fiction. We know that most industrial pieces of equipment are controlled by what we call SCADA systems, SCADA controllers. SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems. These SCADA systems are fairly old. They control the vast majority of industrial machinery. They're absolutely widespread across the Western world. They're fairly simple systems in terms, think of old Microsoft DOS commands. And what has happened over recent years is that they've become increasingly connected to the internet, either wired or wireless systems. And the wireless systems provide just another entry point for someone to take over these SCADA systems and make them do things that they're not supposed to do. And you don't need to have someone in the plant doing nefarious stuff. You have essentially someone sitting thousands of kilometers away controlling your SCADA systems and your machinery. Again, it's not science fiction. The Stuxnet event is real. And just last year, another example of that is a group that had managed to take control of the SCADA systems of a water dam in upstate New York. Nothing bad happened, but they were able to control some of the systems in that water dam, in that power dam. These cyber attacks have, it's a form of cyber attack. They've affected banking, financial systems. We've seen it in the recent attacks in Ukraine and Crimea, where financial transactions and communication systems were paralyzed. I'd like to switch now to a slightly different sort of national security threat that has an impact or a nexus with food and food security, again, from a different perspective, and that is food transportation. Food transportation, 80% of all global trade is transported by sea. Global trade, I'm not referring specifically to food trade. 80% of all global trade is transported by sea. 60% transits through the South China Sea. And you read the news just as much as I do, I'm sure, and you're aware that this 60% of all maritime traffic going through the South China Sea could easily be disrupted by a regional conflict in that region, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Philippines and China disputing some piece of territory. Any disruption in maritime traffic in that region would have global repercussions. And it's not so much just in terms of food or food ingredients, but it's also the machinery, the equipment that is used to produce food and food transportation. The third element that I'd like to highlight is the fact that none of the economic progress we've seen in the last 50 years would really have been made possible without another crucial ingredient, and that is a cheap energy source in the form of fossil fuel. The global economic system remains highly dependent on fossil fuels. Food production, food transportation is no exception. And this is another point of disruption in our system. We have seen over the last couple of years countries exercise pressure or flex their muscles by threatening or by actually shutting down oil and gas supplies across different parts of the world. I'll come back later to some of the geopolitics that we're seeing now that need to that we need to pay attention to. In reality, in terms of food security, food production, a lot of the economic progress we've seen over the last several decades boil down to really a couple of essential ingredients. The first one is the extraordinary expansion of global trade. This has far outpaced the output growth since the 60s. We've also seen significant increase in foreign direct investment across border capital flows during the same period. Globalization essentially means that there are fewer producers of very specific products or materials, and that creates essentially interdependencies that can easily be disrupted. The other trend that we're seeing is certainly one of growing scarcities of land, water, marine capture, fisheries, and biodiversity resources. And these trends will likely continue to be exacerbated by social drivers and natural factors that include climate change. We'll talk a little bit about this later, and extreme weather events. And really the food industry is part and parcel of that problem because agriculture is a significant contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. We can quibble about the exact number. Some people talk about roughly a quarter of world emissions are associated with agriculture. And agriculture, of course, is also heavily water intensive, accounting for up to 3/4 freshwater use. We know we need to continue to increase food production. Some say 60% by 2050. And we also know that crop productivity that has in the past been fueled a lot by genetic improvement is going to be challenged. We've seen a slowing down of the gains in crop productivity associated with genetic improvement. GM crops have allowed some progress in some species, fairly few species. At the end of the day, and things like CRISPR, the new genetic modification technologies that promise even more potential for increase of crop productivity, are going to face the same debates that we have faced with the old-fashioned genetic modifications in crop production. What's exacerbating the problem here with new genetic technologies is that when the old-fashioned genetic modifications were introduced around 2000, well, 1995, 2000, we were having debates, different groups were having debates as to the safety of those genetic modifications. Just imagine now, with social media, what would happen to that debate, how fast it could derail, how fast fake news, quote unquote, could be spread. It appears we've had groups that have influenced the outcome of elections in some countries or the outcome of some referendum. Now imagine what this kind of social media manipulation can have on an issue that is as critical as food safety. So I'm going to finish on a fairly simple observation. What we're seeing around the world is, in many parts of the world, is a hardening of borders between countries. The hardening of those borders has all kinds of drivers, whether it's nationalism, populism, self-protection, so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. We're seeing an increasing level of geopolitical self-interest, if I can call it that, over international collaboration. Is this a trend towards keeping more of the resources necessary for food production, whether it is the food ingredients, whether it's the genetic resources, whether it is the fuel, whether it is the equipment? Is this the start of a trend towards keeping more of those resources within national borders therefore impacting the ability of other countries to be self-sufficient or to produce food and export and benefit from that. Essentially, this picture is one of uncertainty, volatility. We don't know the probability of those events. We know the impact would be significant if those barriers to that hardening of the borders were to happen. There's been a lot of negative energy, so to speak, that has been built into the global system in recent years. I don't think it is a question of whether we will see any one of the events that I've described. I think it's a matter of when, it's not a matter of if. We have invested a very, very large amount of time and energy and resource in enhancing the safety of our food processing, our food production systems. A huge amount of energy has been invested in that, and other speakers this afternoon will talk about this. And we can be really proud of the progress we've made on that front. But I would argue that these food safety at the food processing or food production levels, these are elements that the industry controls directly. The elements that I've referred to earlier, whether it's the introduction of a computer virus, whether it is the cutting off of food supplies, has nothing to do with food itself. It has more to do with the geopolitics of a region rather than a direct intervention in the food system. But these two types of interventions are directly connected. So these national security elements that I've made reference to are not elements that the industry controls. They're bigger than they're higher than our pay grade, so to speak. And they're variables outside that system. Are these security threats greater than they have been in the past? My answer to you is yes, simply because of the interconnectedness that has been built into our systems now, and the ability of groups very far, very geographically disconnected to be able to intervene in our system. I will stop here. I don't know, Jason or Bruce, whether we have time for questions or whether you want to keep them at the end. I'll be present at the end as well. So I'll be with you for the rest of the afternoon.
Okay.
Jason, back to you.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you, Marc.